And once I got to that point of acceptance that this is over, and I felt that's what God said to me, this isn't fixable. Now, I didn't know all the details of what was going to come, but I felt, okay, I've come to terms with the reality of this, and I'm now no longer sort of grieving, or the emotions of it are not as raw, and I'm not feeling what I was feeling in the beginning. And that took a number of months.
If I could start, my son phoned me yesterday, my youngest son.
Yeah.
And he was on about, when you sent us to Christian school all the way through, or kindergarten on, what a waste of time that was. It's no different. And he went on and on and on. He said, God doesn't really get involved in a whole lot. And then he brought up the scripture, Romans 8:28, all things work together for good to them that love God and are called according to his purpose. Then he went on and said, that doesn't mean he really makes it good for you. And I said, no, it doesn't. Because you're in alignment with him, he can work it out for good. And so, like with Stephen, even though it didn't turn out good for Stephen, it worked out for God's purpose for good. And he went, see, that's what I meant. There's no advantage to this over anyone else. And then I noticed, before I went to bed, I looked up the in the Mirror Bible. It said, we know that the love of God causes everything to mutually contribute to our advantage. His master plan to, in our assumed in our eternal destiny by name. And so, and I thought, well, these are our needs, but in answer to my son, and I don't even know myself really. For example, you went through some difficult times, and you must have said, and what happened wasn't what you probably at one time wanted to happen, and you wouldn't have considered that time probably that being good. And I'm just trying to understand how you can relate to that, and how I can even relate to my son about that.
Okay. I think when it comes to our relationship with God and how that benefits us and how that works out in our lives, it depends on how we approach it in our own mindset. If we think it's of no real advantage and there's nothing really, well, then probably that's how we will live from that perspective. So our perspective, or our thinking, the renewing of our mind, sort of removes us from the mold that separates us from God in our thinking. So if we are engaging with God intimately, then we will find that he is there in our lives to guide us, direct us, protect us, and do all those things. Now, does that mean nothing bad happens? No. But maybe a lot of bad things that might have happened didn't happen. And that's unquantifiable. That's the thing. You can't quantify what hasn't happened. And I believe God protects us, keeps us safe. But if something does happen, in other words, God can't force someone not to do something, then he does work all those things together for our good. God wants to bring good out of everything. So every choice we make, he wants to bring good. Now, if someone kills somebody, well, for that person who's dead, the good is they'll end up in God's presence. But those left behind, that's who God will then be engaged with in that process. So it's not an easy one, to fully grasp hold of. But if you're looking for a relationship with God for just the benefits, then that isn't what a relationship's about. My relationship with God is how I can be surrendered into that relationship as to my dad and his purposes, which I trust are best for me and everybody else. So for me, my relationship is about me surrendered to that purpose and outworking and fulfilling who he made me to be. And he is involved in that. He wants to reveal to me all the time who he made me to be, so that I can find my place within the kingdom, within the world, in a way that will enable me to feel fulfilled and satisfied and contented outworking who I am, just being me, really. So when it comes then to, well, doesn't seem that God has any favorites. Of course he doesn't. There's no favorites at all. But I know my relationship with God. Those who don't. So they're not enjoying the love that God has for them. They're not enjoying God's peace and God's rest. And they're not enjoying the fact that God is their healer and their provider, and he is the one who's their righteousness. And they're living still in the world which is driven by the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and their own self. So they're self-focused. And I think that's the difference. When you have a relationship with God, you're not self-focused, you're God-focused. And God didn't make us as slaves. He made us so he can love us. And of course, love, unconditional love, is about giving without a reward. So God is not waiting for us to do the good things or the reward stuff so he can reward us. He just wants us to enjoy relationship. So the difference between those who don't know God and those who do is the relationship. And ultimately, relationship is everything. That is what everything was designed for, relationship. Father, Son, and Spirit are in relationship, and they wanted to share that circle of relationship and bring all of us into that circle of relationship so we can enjoy love and joy and peace and rest in that relationship. And I would say for most people, although God is at work still to protect them and keep them safe and bring about something good in their lives, they're not enjoying the relationship. They're not enjoying what God is wanting us to live in, love, joy, and peace and rest. So they're striving. And they're looking for life sensors in the wrong places, probably, and end up getting hurt and damaged and everything else. And of course, God doesn't want that. So I think to say God has favorites is not true. He wants everyone to enjoy the fullness of the benefits of relationship with him. But those who don't know him in that relationship aren't enjoying the knowledge of those benefits or the thanksgiving or the gratitude or the attitude that those benefits brings. Because if you're living with thanksgiving and gratitude, which is for me part of rest, then your whole body and soul, mind is all programmed for self-repairing and health and wholeness and healing. If you're not living in the thanksgiving and gratitude of that relationship with God, then generally people tend to be miserable. And that programs, thoughts are toxic, emotions are toxic. That affects their lives in a negative way. So a relationship with God should not be self-centered or selfish. And in God's side of it, God wants to bless us. And he wants us to know that we're blessed so that we can live in the good of that blessing and enjoy everything that blessing is designed to do. And ultimately, so we can live in the presence of God in a intimate way without having to go through all the doings and works and anything, in a sense of me trying to do something for something else. So our advantage in it is that we know and we can experience everything that God is doing, and we can be thankful and grateful for it. And that actually causes us to live in a state of being which is more healthy and designed for us to be in oneness and union and fellowship and communion with God and creation. So that's how I would see it. Now, God is at work to bring about good, but that good is not how we define good. And we've got to be careful that we don't ascribe our understanding on God, because if we lean to our own understanding, then we're going to have all those questions. Whoa, why did God allow this? Why did God allow that? Why did this happen? Why did it happen? And then you end up sort of a whole sort of mindset of doubt and unbelief and worry and anxiety and all of those things. Whereas if you trust God as God and you know he's your dad, then you trust him to bring and want the best for you. and to bring about that even when we make the wrong choices. So God will bring good out of our choices, even if it's just us learning not to make that choice again. It's still something good that we've learned. And I think God wants us to learn to grow and to mature and to become more like him in the way we think and the way we act, which is why we are made in the righteousness of God, to be like him. Yeah.
Mike,
Yeah.
I have a testament actually to that. During the holiday weekends, during Christmas and New Year, I was, to say it mildly, very indulgent in the food and drink department. And with the net result that my blood pressure went sky high. You know, I was getting dizzy spells and all that. And thanks to your sound bites, I went through healing part 1 and part 2.
Yeah.
Of course. And then that's when you know you need spirit, soul, and body has to be in harmony together. So the first thing was that on the physical level, my daughter was a nutritionist. She put me on a detox, no gluten. Then I knew I had to fix the soul issues also. So I started the process that you suggested. The first thing was to apologize to my body for what I had done to it. And then I went about actually getting rid of the trauma and what I went through at the end of it. Then I also went through my gateways. I said, I need to get rid of anything in the process. And it's shocking, actually, what I found, all the junk that I found out, the decisions I was making based on my belief system, you know, in the world health system as compared to God's system that he has there, you know, and the power and the grace that he is available for us. At the end of it, yesterday I shoveled snow for about 2 hours after that and felt great. I felt energized and all that. And the absolute benefit is that I now have such a deeper level of relationship with my Father. You know, so it's the process. It's like, well, will you allow God to help you come to will you allow his grace and mercy to operate, or are you going to have this fear, which is a negative energy, which will stop his grace from? So I understand what you're saying with the state of rest. You need to come to a point where you allow God to help in your life.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think we're driven to try and fix things ourselves. And we're driven to work out of our own understanding, which is very far removed from the way God does things or thinks. And that's what the world is programmed into, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. It's independence. You can do this. You can solve your problems. You can fix this. You know, you can self-improve. You can self-help. You can do all those things. But all those things are self. Try to do it without God. Now, God is trying to work with us, even when we're trying to do it without God. But ultimately, you don't live in rest when you're striving all the time in your own strength. And, you know, we do have issues in our lives, which we use things in material sense to replace God. And that could be all sorts of things. It could be food, it could be money, it could be success, it could be power, you know, it could be fame. You know, things which we use in a material sense, bigger house, bigger car, better things, all that. Well, I'll be happy when I have all these things. And we know those things don't actually really produce real happiness. You know, I guess it's better to have a nice house than not have a nice house. But actually having a nice house or not having a nice house is not the issue when it comes to how we feel about ourselves and how we relate to the world around us. And I do feel that God wants us to get to that point where our relationship with him is what frames our life and which gives us a foundation on which everything is established, you know. But it does require sometimes a reset or a refresh or, you know, a point where you take stock of where is my thinking, and what am I using to compensate or make me happy, or do I have defense mechanisms or coping mechanisms, and why are relationships with certain people more difficult than others, and what's going on, and sometimes things creep up on us. We don't realize just how much we have sort of taken on of the world's system of materialism, effectively, to produce something in our lives. And then it's great when we then do a detox in our thinking and in our emotions and in our body, and just look at the whole dynamic of where we are and are we at rest. And I think that's the key. If we know what rest is like, then we'll detect when we're out of rest. The frequency of rest, that harmonious place of being in union and communion with the Father. And when you're not, you should know, in a sense. But sometimes, little by little, it's like putting the frog into boiling water, and it will really, really feel the pain. But if you put it in cold water and you heat the water up degree by degree, the frog basically just ends up getting cooked, and essentially things can happen, 1 degree and 1 degree and 1 degree, and you don't necessarily always notice. When something big happens, then you tend to be more aware, but things tend to creep up. And I think that's why we've got to have a consistent being in the presence of God, living in a place of rest. And from that place of rest, then being aware. That's the key. Am I aware of what's happening in my life? Am I aware of my thinking? Am I aware physically? Am I aware of my eating habits, or am I just sort of not really thinking about it? And I do think rest gives us an opportunity to be reflective and meditative, and just to ask the questions of ourselves and God. Father, show me if there's any areas which are out of tune or out of sync or out of alignment or are not healthy in my spirit, soul, body, in the relationship that they have one to another, and whether I am in one wholeness. Am I whole? Or am I operating out of some memory or fragmentation or whatever it might be? And I do feel the more we spend time in rest, the more easy it is to be aware of anything which impacts that rest. And I think if you only do a sort of checkup every few months or every 6 months, then things can creep up on you. If you're generally sort of checking yourself and measuring yourself in one sense against what rest really is, then you've got more of an opportunity of actually getting the small things. Because as I say, the little foxes spoil the vines. And in a sense, it's the little things that tend to creep up. The big major things, when they happen, we tend to go to God with it. The little things, sometimes we tend just to try and fix ourselves, or just do things out of habit or that sort of thing. And I think being more aware of where I am, and I think gratitude and thanksgiving are really big indicators of where we are in a state of rest. Because if I'm genuinely thankful and grateful for things in my life, and I am not my thinking is not focused on the negative, and I'm not looking at what I don't have, but I'm focused on the positives of what I do have, then that's a good indicator that things are going well. And then when something, isn't quite as then we can deal with it, because we can take it to the throne of grace to find grace and mercy. We don't have to try and fix it. And I think the tendency for most humans, because of the Tree of the Knowledge of Good and Evil program, is to fix it, to try and make it better, to try and do better, to try and be better, to try and all of that is energy sapping. Because when Jesus said, all who are weary and heavy laden or burdened, come to me and find rest, it was because they were doing it all in their own strength and their energy was sapped. But if they came to him and find rest, then, and he said rest for your souls primarily, but that's not, limited to the soul, can be the whole of our being, then we will begin to find from a place of rest that we'll find our identity is more clear. That's why he said, take my yoke upon you, learn from me, because I'm gentle and humble in heart. And that gentleness is strength, knowing who you are, but it being surrendered to God. And, humility is accepting who you are from God's perspective and not trying to create your own identity from what you do. And rest brings you to that place where you cease striving to do it yourself, really.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, you said like a frog in a pot. It happens by degrees, slowly and slowly, and then suddenly you have a wake-up call where you have to, when you realize how far you strayed from the original way of dealing with things, how God intends it, and then coming back. Actually, I restarted doing your modules, like first love and gardens and everything, and I realized like how sort of toxic my thinking had become, because if you don't see everything through unconditional love and limitless grace and his mercy, then you're straight far away. And even if you have even a twinge of worry, or those are indicators that you need to go back to the basics and sort of
Well, I think you only have to be half a degree off in the course you set. If you go far enough, you're a long way off the place you should be, and it doesn't appear that far. I mean, half a degree, that didn't very well. Half a degree at the beginning is hardly anything, but if you travel 500 miles, you're going to be a long way out after 500 miles if you're half a degree out at the start. And I think that's the key, not going so far without course correcting, making sure that your course is always recorrected and you're always brought back onto the path where you're walking with the Father and not walking independently or on your own. Because if you're here and the Father's here and you're walking together in parallel, well, then you're always going to be close. But when you're here with the Father and it's a half a degree off, it may be a fair way before you realize that you're not quite there, or you might not even realize until you're over here and the Father's over there. Well, the Father's not moved from the path that you were walking on. You've moved just drifting away, if you like. And I think that's why having a sort of reflective way of thinking about where am I and how am I actually feeling, what is going on? Do I feel close? Do I feel, where's the Father? And actually getting that course correction if we have drifted off a little bit, or we've gone off at a tangent. Sometimes even doing something good could take us off course because it might not have been the thing that God wanted us to do. And I think that is another thing. Just because something appears to be good doesn't mean that it's good for us. So I think it's always checking out or being so close to the Father's heart that you just know, no, that's not something I should get involved in. That's not something for me right now. It's a good thing. And some people just can't help themselves. They have to go and do it. If it's a problem, they've got to go and try and fix it. And they've got to get involved, and they might find, well, the Father's not there. And then they're on their own, then they get weary, and then it's hard work, and then all the other things creep in. So I think constant course corrections, constant awareness of how close we are, the intimacy of being rather than doing is always a good thing, to just regularly check up, have a health check, from how am I feeling, where am I, when was the last time that God spoke to me or I spoke to him, or we had some sort of intimate relational perspective to it? Or have I just drifted off and just carried on with life because life is busy, there's lots to do, I've got a lot of responsibility, or I have all this on my plate, and I've got all these plates I'm juggling as well. Sometimes, we can take our focus off the main thing, and minor things have a greater significance when we've taken our eyes off the main thing and drifted away, and are doing a lot of things on our own in our own strength without necessarily always realizing it initially. So I would encourage people, don't have extended times where you're not engaged with God, or are reflective about where you are with God, and you're talking to him about, where am I? Is there anything? Have I drifted off anywhere? Because sometimes it's not everything where we're drifted off. It might just be an aspect of our life. It might just be a little thing. But those little things can become big things if we're not careful. Times of refreshing come from the presence of the Lord. And that is so we can breathe easily again, so we can be drawing life from him and not living independent.
And then I also noticed that where your destiny is concerned, so this experience is, when you look at the world system and draw your knowledge, it limits your consciousness to the world system, and you lose sight of your eternal destiny. What does God really create you for? What did he make you for? And
yeah. It is, because essentially we get caught up in doing other stuff, and a lot of that isn't bad stuff. It can food is food. All food is potentially beneficial if you eat it in the right proportions and the right amounts. If you eat too much of any one thing, it can become a health risk or problem, and therefore balance and harmony in it all is really important. And therefore, a lot of activity in our life, there's nothing wrong in it, but if it's out of balance and out of proportion, it can be weary and heavy and feel, sort of a weight of responsibility. When, if we're yoked to Jesus and he's carrying the weight, then we only have to do what we see the Father doing, like Jesus did. And that means we can be not at the mercy of other people and what other people want us to do, because other people will fill our time with all sorts of things. They'll have demands on us for various things, whereas God doesn't place demands on us. He just wants the relationship that will flow into an outworking of his heart through who he made us to be. And there's no real sense of pressure of you just being you. You trying to be someone else puts you on a lot of pressure. That's why we shouldn't be comparing ourselves with other people, or what they're doing, or what their destiny is, or what level of workload they've got. We shouldn't be looking at anyone else. Keep our eyes fixed on the Father, because then we'll see reflected back who we are. If we keep looking around at other people and, oh, look at what they're doing, look at all that, and look at this and look at that, then we tend to get feeling, well, we're not doing enough, or, well, maybe I should be doing what they're doing. And so many people have tried to be like someone else because they felt someone else was successful, or that their relationship with God was wonderful. Well, we can only be us. Trying to be someone else is really, really hard work, because you haven't got the empowerment to be someone else. You've only got the empowerment to be you.
Mike, we're listening to Nancy Cohen, and she was, talking about the different ages and church age, kingdom age, and she mentioned the age of perfection. Is the age of perfection the same as the kingdom age? Do you know?
To be honest, I don't really go for all those ages things. In that I tend to find they can be a bit elitist, oh, well, we're the age of Melchizedek, and well, we're the age of sonship, and you're in the church age, and I understand God has worked in different ways at times, but we've been in the kingdom age from when Jesus established the kingdom and gave it to us. We may not have been functioning in what that meant, but we've been in it. We may have established church as a substitute for kingdom, and there are a lot of people still in that, but it's the revelation for me of what already exists, not something new. There have been people who've been living in the kingdom age from the beginning, all the way through history. Some people have been living in the kingdom age, but a lot of others have been living in what we would call an outworking of the natural church stuff, and for them, I don't think God created a church age and then created a kingdom age and then created an age of perfection or an age of Melchizedek or an age of sonship. Do I think that we are maturing as sons so that we have an understanding of what sonship is and what the order of Melchizedek is? Absolutely. And of the responsibility within the kingdom? Absolutely, yes. But I don't think they're new things. They've always been there, and some people have embraced them. Some people are operating of the order of Melchizedek from the beginning, from when Jesus established sort of this sort of period of where the kingdom of God is filling the earth. So I tend to sort of shy away from those type of things which measure people and revelation, and in some way seems, well, we've gone further than you now, and we're maybe better than you. I'm not saying Nancy is saying that, but there's a temptation that other people might feel that. Hence, there are some groups who have all these different ages, and and I've heard, seen some of the things written, and it just seems derogatory to others and very elitist. So, well, we don't operate in this anymore. We don't need to use the courts of heaven anymore. We don't need to do this because we've now ascended to another level. It's like, you can carry on doing that baby stuff, but we've ascended to another level. And it's like, it's a bit arrogant, and I don't really like thinking about it in those terms. The same thing as, I don't really go with the 30-fold, 60-fold, 90-fold, or 100-fold thing either, because that says you have got a limit in your life of 10-fold or 30-fold or 60-fold or whatever. You've got a limit. Well, I don't think God has got a limit on anyone. God wants us to fulfill all of our potential as sons of God. And I don't think that has a limit. That might have different roles and different functions, but that's very different from, well, you only know 30% of your destiny because that's all you're ever going to know. And it's just like, well, God doesn't limit and put that on people. Again, and I think it's a degree of comparison about what they're doing. Oh, well, you're doing all of this stuff. Well, you must be a 60-folder, or look at you, you've got, And again, I just sort of think, let's just look at ourselves and our relationship with God, and not really look at other people and start making judgments on whether they're this or that or the other, or where they are on their journey. And I feel all of this is a journey of revelatory discovery and experience. And yes, understanding the order of Melchizedek, understanding living in perfection. Absolutely. I've spent a lot of time over the last 3 or 4 years engaging in the realm of light in perfection, heart to heart with the Father. And that's brought me into a much deeper perspective of being continually aware of that presence, heart to heart, continually connected, not going in there and coming back out of there, just dwelling and abiding and remaining in that presence within the realm of perfection. And I definitely have enjoyed that, but it's not that that wasn't available 10 years ago. It was. I just wasn't ready for it. I wasn't in a place where I could have experienced it or known about it, but it was there. It hasn't suddenly just opened up and become available. It's always been there, but we've now just become aware of it. And I think that's really how I would see our maturity and ascending as sons. We're becoming aware of who we already were from God's perspective, and we're becoming aware of what our identity unveils in terms of sonship and access to various things that we didn't see before. Rather than, well, the church age is this and this age, and then that one stops. Well, it doesn't stop, it carries on for a start. So if there are different things that God does, they sort of overlap one another. One doesn't end and another one begins. It's just, I think, awareness of something rather than the fact that it suddenly has just appeared out of nowhere.
Mike, tying in with what Ruth asked you, and I think he answered it, but I just want to ask it one more time. I've heard so often that we are so blessed, and God has opened up since 2012 this time for us now, which allows us to become aware. But if I understand what you're saying, that's not really the case, because in fact, ever since Christ came, it's being opened by God, and we've been allowed to become aware back then, 2,000 years ago, as much as we have today. Is that correct? It's not just a special time that I'm living in?
No, yes, I agree with what you're saying. It isn't just a special time I'm living in, but I am living in a time where I might have more understanding of the world, creation, and knowledge has increased, in that I'm now more aware of things that are happening around the world, which they wouldn't have been. But I don't believe that there were things off limits to them, but they may not have been. It's like Jesus said, well, loads of things I want to tell you, but you're not able to bear them yet. And I do feel that there's a sense where, if God spoke to Paul about quantum physics, so he could explain that to the first century Christians, it would have been pretty irrelevant because they've had no idea of the language or meaning. But today he can speak to us about things because knowledge has increased, and that gives us sort of maybe a slightly deeper perspective to things. But I don't feel that heaven has only become open in the last 10 years, or being engaged in the four faces of God or the order of Melchizedek has only been available. But revelation has come because people have engaged it, experienced it, and have been able to share it on a much grander scale. I mean, the early church, let's say someone wrote something in, Istanbul or wherever it was then, Constantinople, I guess it would have been then. It's like, would that have reached Australia? No. Would it have reached America? No. But today it can reach anywhere and everywhere very quickly. So I think we are in a privileged position today because of the revelation that is being shared, creates morphic resonance. And morphic resonance is the term given to when someone doesn't know or thinks something is possible, let's say, someone does it and shares that they've done it, all of a sudden, others now start doing it. Whereas they didn't do it before because that wasn't shared. And it isn't just always knowledge either. It can be just something resonates and causes people to believe. So, Roger Bannister was the first person to break the 4-minute mile, and scientists basically said it's impossible for man to run a mile under 4 minutes. It's impossible. Man doesn't have the capability of doing it. Well, Roger Bannister disagreed and practiced and trained and had a group training with him that pushed him, and then they helped him, and he broke the 4-minute mile barrier. And within weeks, several people did it. Within months, lots of people did it, and within a few years, college students were doing it. So that has happened. In that when, like, for instance, I go into heaven in 2010 and begin to share my experiences, the people that I met and knew who didn't even know that that was possible suddenly become aware that it's possible. And some of them not just become aware it's possible, want to do it. So they pursue it. Well, if I hadn't shared it, would they have pursued it? Well, maybe God would have still been at work in their lives to bring them to that place, but God uses forerunners to make it easier for others. When people were looking to discover the Northwest Passage and all those type of things, someone, when they did it, opened up the door for others to do it easier because they showed them the route. And I think that's what God always uses forerunners to say, hey, there's more over here. Come and get it. You know, this belongs to you as well. It's not just for us or me. So I do feel that has always been there, but we are living in an age which has made it easier for us to actually hear the testimony of others and be inspired by that testimony. You know, when you look back at the mystics and the, you know, Julian of Norwich and all the people, Jane Lead Ward and all the people that, you know, Justin would talk about and whatever, and you look back, there weren't that many of them that we know about, because probably most of them couldn't write. So they probably were more than we think, but we wouldn't know who they were unless we met them in the cloud of witnesses or something, because they didn't write down their experiences and they weren't passed on. We just have the ones who were able to write down their experiences. So they become they're the sort of big heroes of the faith and the mystics of the past. And great, but I'm sure there are plenty others as well, but probably not as many as are today, because we're living in an age where we have advantages over those in the past.
Mike,
But I don't think in reality God has actually done anything different.
wouldn't you think in the old days, so too, if people said that, like some of them would call them witches and they would be destroyed. So I'm sure there's many people who just kept it in their heart because they knew that there would be consequences, because people wouldn't understand it.
Oh, absolutely. And at the end of the day, same today, you know, a lot of people would call us New Age, and, you know, the religious people would struggle with encountering an angel or encountering God or going into heaven, you know, and therefore they would brand us with a sort of derogatory title in some way, you know, and that's always probably been the case. So I agree. There's probably lots of people who, you know, either couldn't share or couldn't write, or those who were keeping themselves safe because they knew they were going to be branded if they did something supernatural, you know. And ultimately, we've got to understand also that the world went through the dark ages in which revelation became much harder for people to experience, because it was then through the religious institutional church and the Latin sort of Catholic versions of the Bible, you know, which was a dead language that hardly anyone spoke. And that was the language they read the Bible in, so, or produced the Bible in mostly. So that restricted people, and what had spread from Jesus and the early disciples to the early church fathers over the first 300 years up until Constantine, and then, you know, this sort of forming of the Bible, everything spread by word of mouth and by experience. Then all of a sudden it started to become a religious institutional thing. Take the sacraments, you know, do this and you'll be okay. And eventually within 400 years, you've got people, you know, threatening people with the sword to accept Jesus, you know, or else we're going to kill you, you know. And again, missionaries, you know, missionary zeal was as much with the sword as anything else when they were going to South America, and the conquistadors and all of that, Christendom and all of that type of thing, and Charlemagne and all of the stuff that ended up, it's like, how did they get from the gospel spreading of love and Jesus saying it's by your love for one another that the world will know you're my disciples? How did it get to that, to if you do not accept Jesus, A, you're going to go to hell, but B, we're going to send you there quicker with a sword? You know, how did it get there? Well, because they stopped using the word of mouth testimony and relationship of what it was like, and it became an institution that was now fixed with priests and function and confessional and all those things. You know, and I would say the biggest contributing factor to that, other than Constantine, was the formation of the Bible. In that then they had a rich, and that was predated by the creeds. We believe this. Make sure you believe this, because this is what is right. because they were afraid of people going off into wrong things. And actually they didn't need to be afraid of that. The Holy Spirit can sort that out. What they should have been is beware of the leaven of Herod and the Pharisees. So now everything had become political and religious. That's what they should have been concerned about, not whether some doctrine had gone off a little bit here, there, or whatever. The Holy Spirit will always bring that back. But when you start operating in that religious system, and you start operating in the religious political spirit, then things descended into what we know as the Dark Ages, and descended quickly into the Dark Ages as soon as people stopped operating in the spirit and started operating as a religious institutional structure of control, effectively. And they were all used, church and state, to control everything, then control the people, make sure the people don't know this, that, and the other, keep them in the dark, only let them know what you want them to know, and only let them know what we can use to control them with fear, and how God will punish them if they don't, toe the line. All of that stuff sort of came in, when they stopped trusting in the Spirit and they started trying to control what people believed through creeds and through the Bible and through doctrine and theology rather than relationship. And sadly, that lasted for a long, long time, and it's still there now in the institutional church for a lot of people. Now, a lot of people now can read the Bible in English or their own language, but that doesn't mean that they're not interpreting it through their own understanding or through their own doctrinal systems that they've been brought up with. So it doesn't really help them unless they have the Spirit. And the Spirit is not primarily trying to teach us to understand the Bible. The Spirit is trying to help bring us into the truth, who is Jesus, and our relationship with the Father. So there's a lot that's happened, which I think has got us off course. And I do believe God wants to bring us back to the simplicity of relationship and stop trying to figure it all out in a doctrinal sense and explain it all. Let's enjoy it. Let's experience it, and let's share that experience of love with the world, so the world will also find that love in God. And I think that's ultimately, what's happened. And I sort of don't believe that there are different ages, but I do believe God brings progressive revelation of what is already true. For most people, they can't take it all in one go. So revelation is progressively revealed so that we can bring about the change that revelation brings by renewing our minds and transforming our lives, so that eventually we will be restored into the true and full revelation of sonship.
But Mike, don't you think there is a cycle to everything, that the age of Aquarius or the age of Pisces? I think Jesus came at the beginning of the age of Pisces. And I believe when everything is in alignment, God, we need to cooperate with God, with what God is doing in that particular time, because time also is quite important and critical.
I have some sense of, I know Chris Carter and people talk about the cosmic clock and all this stuff. For me, that can be almost demotivating for people to think it's taken 2,000 years to get from Pisces to Aquarius. It's like, man, I'm not going to be around in 2,000 years. So what's the point of that? And I find people find very difficult to relate to something of an age that lasts 2,000 years, to think, well, I'm not going to make any difference in 2,000 years' time, whatever, when this cosmic clock changes into another age. And I do believe, in a sense, that the passage of the constellations through through the heavens may have some influence, and there may be some things that God sort of equates to it. But if you look at the story of redemption in the stars, if you like, Bullinger's stuff and all of that, I think it's less likely to be, less like the Mayan calendar of, well, we've gone through a cycle of 24,000 years and that's the end. Well, it did, and we just sort of carried on to the next 24,000 year cycle. I believe that we are designed to not be subject to time, but time is subject to us. And therefore, I don't think we should be thinking about 2,000 years to cycle this. If we know how to cycle the chancellor's houses and engage with the ambassadors of the ages of man, then I think we are there to rule and to govern and to establish these things, not to be waiting, think, oh, well, I got to wait for another 2,000 years. And the temptation is people read into the age of Aquarius, the pouring out of water, they will equate that to revival. God, the revival is going to happen. Jesus is going to fix it all, so we're going to have the Spirit poured out or water poured out. And, and obviously the water pouring, there's a sense where, things do get poured out at times, but I don't think we're in for 2,000 years pouring out of water in 2,000 years of revival. Well, what happens after that in the next 2,000 years? I think it can sort of put you into a sort of, well, I got to do this every day. How am I going to live today, rather than, well, where do I fit into the cycle of 2,000 years? Where am I today? And am I in relationship with God, outworking God's purposes through me today? And break it down into a very small point of time. I have today. I've got this minute. What am I doing? Am I enjoying? Is there joy? Is there rest in this minute? And I think for some, 2,000 years is just too much of a period to think about because it's so separated from real life. I'd rather be looking at moment to moment living rather than 2,000 years. Now, I don't know enough about it, and God really hasn't spoken to me too much about it all. Maybe that's sort of other people like Chris Carter and others, that's their thing. And we may be in the transition between, Pisces and Aquarius. And we might be at that point, but what does that really mean? You still have to have the application to my life of how does that relate to me and where I am in my life today. And I would be more in tune to, am I on this process of ascension to maturity? And therefore, do I have an understanding of how to manage my life within the context of what God is doing? So the chancellor's houses are a cycle which don't take 2,000 years. They can cycle in 2 months. They could cycle in a year. So there's things where I've learned that there are cycles and seasons in my life of revelation and change and transformation to maturity. I don't think I have to wait for Aquarius and then the next one and the next one to embrace what that might mean in symbolic perspective. Because if I embrace the transformation that's designed for my life, then the circle of the deep, or, which is the bigger outer wheel, has an inner wheel and an inner wheel within a wheel within a wheel. And if I'm cycling around the inner wheel, that operates sort of on a more succinct time. So, I remember engaging with the Firestones, having encounters, and they would set me on a cycle where I would encounter a precept of God, and that would begin to change my thinking, the statutes and the ordinances, the laws of my life and all that. And I'd find out that I was in a process, a cycle of change. That cycle of change, if I embraced it, might take 6 months. It could take a year. I think the longest it probably took was about 2 years. But I went through various cycles of change. And I learned to cooperate because I learned that what the chancellor's houses did in my life. Now, those chancellors' houses also operate in a wider scale, on a bigger scale, for people groups, or perhaps even the whole world, or for the Joshua generation, or the order of Melchizedek, whatever. I think there are cycles in it, but I've sort of discovered, well, this is how it works. I encounter God, I have a revelation of a precept of God, it changes my thinking, and then it changes my actions, and then it opens a door for me to find a position to outwork what I've learned. And then I get new mantles and scrolls, and I get commissioned into new things because of the maturity I'm in now, because I've gone through and cooperated with this cycle. Then the culture of my life changes, the affairs of my life changes, and the resources are made available for me to live in the revelation of now the level of maturity I have. And I saw that happened before I even knew it happened in my life. But then when I understood the 12 chancellors' houses, then I cooperated with it. And I then functioned with it because I had revelation of it. So I know when I have a revelation of a precept of God, I know this is going to change me. Because if I know God deeper, it's going to enable me to know myself deeper. And therefore that will bring about the change and transformation of my life into that. So for me, yes, there might be a big thing, but I'm more interested in the little thing, which for me cycles those big things around. So I can have the principles of those big periods of whether it's Aries into Pisces, into Aquarius. I don't know what comes after that. I'm not, never really was into those things, but you've got Sagittarius and Capricorn and all of the different ones. Well, I think those things and what they might represent can be affected in my life in the cycle of the smaller wheel. So I might need something of an outpouring of revelation or something in my life, then each of those things I think can operate in my life in that cycle, because I am cooperating with that cycle, or actually I am looking to use that cycle in everyday life for change and transformation. So I don't, otherwise it will be really unfair if you're born in the age of Pisces and you don't ever experience Aquarius. And I don't think that's what God intends, although there may be a big cycle which that represents. But I think I can enjoy all of the 12 things that are represented whenever I need them in my life, if I am cooperating with that inner wheel turning to bring about my transformation or my maturity.
Mike, having listened this morning to everything, going back to where I started, Romans 8:28.
Yeah.
This is what I got. Is this correct? And everything talked about this morning. Rest in God, enjoy God, and through God life, and God will cause everything together to work out.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good summary. Yeah. Yeah, because it works out in relationship, and that's the key. And I trust God to be responsible for that. And the closer I am to him, the less he has to try and, fix my messes, because I'm sort of more in tune to his heart. Therefore, I don't want to do anything which is outside of his heart, but if I do, then he's there to ensure that still gets written into the journey of my life. So I learn from it. And he can even rewrite things in my life to enable me to have those things as part of my journey that I can embrace, But yeah, absolutely. I think it comes, if we stay in that place of peace and rest in relationship and trust the journey and keep walking it out in intimacy, then we'll end up being who God created us to be, wherever that might be outworked. So.
And to the person that's going through those concerns, like say when I was talking to my son, if he's resting in God, enjoying God, and through God's life, those concerns, because God's mutually together working it out, that it's going to start to appear different.
Oh yeah,
it worked out the way that person is going to understand and get, and going to be, that was good.
Absolutely. And you can therefore cast all your burdens on the Lord and stop trying to sort it out yourselves and trust him. You know, that doesn't mean we're passive, but it does mean we don't try and do things in our own strength and get worn out and weary with it all, because it can appear quite wearying when you look at all the terrible stuffs in the world, and maybe people are going through things in their lives and it's, oh, this is such hard work, and all of a sudden people are just looking at the problem, and the problem's getting bigger and bigger, and they're getting more anxious, more worried, more concerned. Cares of life are heavier, you know, rather than, you know, be happy. You know, don't worry, don't worry, don't worry, trust me. You know, and that comes down, do we really trust him? And a lot of people don't. You know, and I didn't, you know, in the past. I do believe I trust him now, but that doesn't mean that the difficulties you go through, that you don't ask him the questions. You know, it's like when I was going through the difficulty where my wife decided to leave, it was like, did I want that? No. Was I happy about it? Absolutely not. Did I want it changed? Yes. You know, did I want it to be restored? Yes. Was it going to be? No. Not if two people didn't want to work together for that restoration. And now I realized that God was definitely in that, because he was getting me out of a situation that I would have never got out of myself, because he wanted something better for me, and hopefully something better for my ex-wife, you know, than we were able to do together. Now I feel I found what that was better, and I'm enjoying that, and you know, I'm living in that. But I look back and I couldn't see that at the time. Now God was with me through it, and I never let the problem of what I was going through bring me down, because I had intimacy with the Father. I knew he loved me. So I didn't feel guilty or condemned or what people think or all that stuff, because I knew he loved me, and I knew what his desire for me was the best. But I thought that must have been restoring what was already there, rather than actually getting me out of that situation, which was never going to change. So he had mercy on me in that sense, so that mercy enabled me to come out of a situation which was inherently unhappy, even though my relationship with God was so good that I was able to cope with that level of unhappiness, because I sort of didn't focus on the unhappiness. I was just grateful for what I did have. But ultimately, I now look back and think I'm thankful that he took me out of a situation which would have carried on being primarily unhappy, to bring me into a situation where I'm much happier and enjoying life in a different dimension, in a different way, and find that I can be myself in a way that I could not be in that previous situation. You know, and now I feel that I know who I am, and the person I am is better than what I thought I was capable of in a relational sense. But he had to get me out of it. So now I thank him for taking me out of it. At the time, I thanked him for enabling me to get through it, you know, and to be with me through it, which he was. And he continued to teach me, and he showed me things, and I learned stuff. And I also had to face my own life and look at, well, I'm not blameless in this situation. You know, I've let it get to this situation where I've not been, you know, where I've settled for something which is not God's best, you know, and I've settled for that. Maybe if I'd fought for it differently or whatever, things might have been different, but ultimately it still takes two to form a relationship. And ultimately, you know, God has, in his grace and mercy, is taking me out of what was sort of potentially an ongoing unhappy situation and bringing me into a situation which is very different. You know, and I am very thankful and grateful. And I think he's able to do exceeding abundantly beyond what I could have asked or thought. Because it's difficult to ask when you've not experienced. So all I could have said was, well, I want it better than what it's been in the past. I didn't know exactly what it could be. So he was able to do beyond what I was probably have asked for. So I'm very grateful and thankful for his grace and mercy and his love. But he was good to me all the way through it, and he definitely has bring good out of the situation. much better than I would have done if I'd tried to sort it out myself. Which is just how good he is, and he's much more loving and kind and patient than I even appreciated. And I'm even more thankful and grateful for his goodness and his mercy and his love.
But Mike, being where you were, if I'm just thinking of myself, I would have been saying, or I might have been declaring from my seat of government, God, keep us together and that kind of stuff, because I would have believed that was the right thing and make it right again. And and that would have been contrary to what God would have wanted. So I'm just kind of like, where do I become active in it?
Well,
because that would have been.
Yeah. Well, I started off that way in like by instinct, sort of almost like, well, I'm going to fight for this and I'm going to whatever. But I didn't feel, as soon as I started to engage God and talk to him about it, I didn't feel that's what he wanted me to do. And which was quite a contradiction, because it was what I felt instinctively I should do. And for the first couple of months of coming to terms with the reality of the situation, of course, I was wanting God to do what he could do and, restore everything and make it better and whatever else. But he never told me he was going to do that. And he never told me or hinted that I should be declaring that. So very quickly, what he showed me was that I'm here, you're going to get through this, but you have to deal with the emotion of it and come to terms with it, because it ain't going to change. So I had to go through the grief cycle, which means you have to admit that something is lost or you've lost something to fully grieve. If you don't admit you're lost, you can't go through that cycle, and therefore it isn't going to change. You're still going to live in what you haven't got. So I had to go through that grief cycle, and therefore I went through the whole, cycle of coming to terms with it and acceptance of eventually, but went through the thing of, hurt and pain and anger and frustration and all the other things, bargaining with God, trying to fix it, or all those things, and bargaining in the relationship to try and fix it, and I went through that to get me to a point of acceptance. No, actually, this is over. And once I got to that point of acceptance that this is over, and I felt that's what God said to me, this isn't fixable. Now, I didn't know all the details of what was going to come, but I felt, okay, I've come to terms with the reality of this, and I'm now no longer sort of grieving, or the emotions of it are not as raw, and I'm not feeling what I was feeling in the beginning. And that took a number of months to get me to the point where now I was going to cooperate with the fact that it wasn't over. Because to start with, I was resisting that, well, no, you're not getting a divorce, and I'm not going to do this, and I'm not going to do that, and tough luck, basically, which was my initial attitude for the first month or so. It was like I still wanted to see it fixed, and therefore I was resisting. But then God brought me to acceptance, and then I thought, well, what's the point of trying to resist something? Because I felt God say, you're no longer in a marriage as far as I'm concerned, because this isn't what marriage really is. So from that perspective, then I came to an acceptance of that, and then I began to cooperate with, okay, this has got to come to an end. But that obviously took 12 months, so I'm still living in the same house. So that was not an easy thing, to live in the same house, but also to know that this relationship is over. So it was quite difficult to manage. And fortunately, my daughter was in the house, which sort of gave some sense of balance. And she sort of was very good in trying to keep it civil and everything else. And there were times when, I was probably not very pleasant, when I was going through an angry phase, or it's like, and then, eventually, but then I still had to deal with the emotions. Every time there was a last time, there was a sense I had to face that this was the last time. So the last wedding anniversary, the last Christmas, the last this, and I had to actually deal with the emotions. So that last Christmas was really not very nice. And I wasn't feeling good emotionally. And I had to process and deal with how I was feeling, because that's a natural feeling. It's not, you can't just bury it and ignore it, because I was feeling it. So in feeling it, I had to deal with it. And so becoming sort of self-aware of why I'm feeling upset or angry, or where I'm feeling just sad. And the sadness was probably the predominant feeling, sadness. Eventually then, when all the stuff were being packed up for her to leave, that was really difficult, because then I had to face the fact that, yeah, this really is happening. It's going to come to an end, and this is going to be this. And then all of the separating of the final things and sorting it all out, had to be done, but I had to deal with all the emotions of it. And I didn't realize I was so emotional, in the sense of feeling that sense of loss, and the last of this and the last of that, and the last time we'll do this as a family, and the last time this will happen, but then after, the 2 weeks or so leading up to that was really hard, and I was emotionally really quite sad. And then the week or so afterwards, I came to terms with it, and then things changed. And then that's when God really sort of started to nudge me towards, you don't have to stay this way. Because I'd settled for, okay, everything's good, I guess I'm at a point where now this is life, I'll have plenty of time just to do whatever I want, and not really think about considering anybody else particularly. But then that's when God said, well, that's selfish. You can make someone else happy. And I was just thinking about, I don't want to be involved with anybody else, because it's just going to be hassle, and in reality, God had to change my heart and change my mind and change me effectively, because I now was free from the constraints of not able to be me, which then changed everything. So, things did progress over a period of time, and I had to work through all of the emotions and thinking and stuff through that period. But God was with me. His grace and mercy were enabling me to do that. And there were times when I was not, it wasn't great, and I was, sad, or was upset, or sometimes angry. And it was like, okay, I can't bury this, but I also can't let it be controlling me either. I have to deal with it, process it, forgive, release, continue to, walk with God through it. And he walked me through it, to the point where then when he took me into this relationship, it was beyond what I could have ever imagined or thought. Not that there aren't issues or struggles or you got to work through, and two people learning to understand each other and learning to know how you work and the different things, the way you think, and all of that. It's still got to be a relationship. A relationship doesn't happen in one day. It's an ongoing process of becoming one and becoming closer and becoming more tolerant and patient and kind to one another when there are differences, and an opportunity about working unconditional love, which is really hard, when I don't think any of us have ever really experienced unconditional love from another human. Because I think it's really hard to love someone unconditionally, and so, I've been thinking about this a lot recently. It's just like, what does it mean to love someone unconditionally? Well, I want the best for them. Well, what happens if the best for them is not the best for me? Or I don't think it is. Well, then I got to make a decision. Am I going to really love this person unconditionally and therefore self-sacrifice or this or whatever it might be in that situation? Well, if it's unconditional love, then yes. Well, that doesn't feel so good sometimes. When you're going to suffer so someone else can feel something or have something, whatever. And it's quite hard, but you've got to work through it. But, being able to understand who you are and outwork that in what love is very different. So before I understood the languages of love, you know, and I understood about how it's people, my language of love, whatever. And I feel I understand a little bit about myself in that, and I understand a little bit now in the other side of it, but I want to give all of those languages. For me, that's an expression of unconditional love. I want to give quality time, you know, and therefore I want to give myself, and I want to give gifts, and I want to give service, and I want to give affirmation, and I want to give physical affection. You know, I want to give all of it. Whereas before, I struggled to give one thing the way someone wanted it. You know, so it's very interesting if you just allow God to bring about their changes and reveal what you're truly capable of. But unconditional love is really hard. You know, and we know how difficult it is to believe God loves us unconditionally, because we've been conditioned by religion to think there's a whole load of conditions attached to his love. Well, it's even more hard when it comes to people. You know, and it's so hard not to be motivated by, well, I want to receive something from this. I deserve this. I deserve that. I deserve to be loved. Well, that is motivating me then into there's a reward. I'm looking to get something out of this. And I don't think that's how unconditional love works. And of course, if two people are loving each other unconditionally, then of course you're going to be receiving and giving as it should be. You're sowing and you're reaping in a relationship. But if you're going into it, I want to reap, so I'm manipulating everything so I can get something out of it, that's not unconditional love. So unconditional love is really quite difficult to know and experience. Now, I believe I've experienced from God, and I believe God has shown me how he sees people and how he feels about them in an unconditional sense. But when it comes to a relationship with someone else, you've got to go through all of the, again, reprogramming and renewing and restoration to bring you to a point where you can love unconditionally, which is really hard. You know, it is hard. And I felt sometimes my feelings aren't right here. This isn't a good way of thinking. You know, and I think, well, why am I thinking that way? And I had to, again, challenge myself and go back to God and say, help me understand why this hurts. You know, well, because I want to be with someone all the time. And it hurts when I'm not with them. Well, you can't be with someone all the time. So you've got to come to the point where you've got to give them space to have things without you. Well, that wasn't very easy. You know, yeah. Because it wasn't, you know, and I've got to be honest, it wasn't. And I found it quite hard. So I was feeling somewhat jealous of her friends. Time with her. Well, they're taking my time with her. Well, that was selfish, you see. And it was like, yeah, I wanted to give her complete unconditional love, and I wanted to be with her and give her quality time, but I was jealous that I couldn't give her quality time all the time, which isn't right. So I had to really sort of then look at, why am I feeling this way? And that isn't actually good. It might be good to want to spend quality time and to give, you know, quality time to someone, but not to the fact that they don't have time to enjoy other people and other things. Otherwise, it becomes obsessive. You know, but when you've never experienced that, it can be feeling quite obsessive to start with, because you're almost like on a high of something that you've sort of kind of come back into the real balance of it. When you first experience something, it can feel very different, you know, because, wow, this is amazing. But then that's got to be balanced into you want the best for the other person, not just for you. So unconditional love, I don't think, is a very easy thing to work out in human relationships without a lot of change and transformation of people, you know, to be like God. You know, that's why we're supposed to be like him. You know, we love because he first loved us. So certainly experiencing his unconditional love is definitely the starting point for being able to love each other unconditionally, but it's still not easy because the other person isn't God. You know, it's really easy for me to love God because I know God's perfect and it's never going to let me down. It's never going to disappoint me and never going to be anything other than unconditional love. So in one sense, you know, that's sort of fairly easy once you get rid of all the religious nonsense about God not being unconditional. But with a person, it's not the same because they're not perfect. So there's always the potential for, well, they're not perfect, and therefore they are not either not receiving what you're giving or they're not able to reciprocate. And that can be hard when you're sort of working through the relationship. But, you know, that's what relationships are, aren't they? They're becoming one, you know, in a sense of choosing to love first.